You have 48 hours to get out of my son's house." The words hit Adeline Parker like a physical blow as she stood in the doorway of what had been her bedroom just 3 days ago. Margaret Whitmore's voice carried that particular ice-cold tone she reserved for people she considered beneath her station. Cold. Final. Devastating. Adeline's hand instinctively moved to her barely visible bump. 3 months pregnant, 3 days widowed, and now homeless. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same woman who had barely tolerated her presence at family dinners was now throwing her out of the only home she'd known for 2 years. "Mrs. Whitmore, please. Andrew left me this house. We discussed. Andrew left you nothing." Margaret's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the marble doorframe. "Everything belonged to the family trust. Everything belongs to us now that he's gone." There's something almost poetic about how quickly life can flip from blessing to curse, how the people who smile at your wedding can become the ones calculating your destruction at your husband's funeral. Adeline had learned this lesson the hard way, standing in a mansion that had never truly been hers, facing a woman who had never seen her as family. But here's what makes this story different from every other tale of grief and betrayal you've heard. This isn't just about a woman who lost everything. This is about a woman who discovered that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out who you really are. And sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up giving you the greatest gift of your life. My name is telling you the story of Adeline Parker. And this is how she went from a broken, pregnant widow with nothing but a suitcase to a woman whose name would one day flash across Forbes magazine as one of the youngest black female billionaires in America. But that transformation didn't happen overnight. And it certainly didn't happen without a fight. If you've ever felt like the world was against you, if you've ever been underestimated because of who you are or where you come from, if you've ever wondered whether kindness and determination can actually triumph over cruelty and privilege, then this story is for you. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will remind you why you should never count out someone who has nothing left to lose. But let me start from the beginning. Back when Adeline still believed that love could conquer anything, including the subtle racism and classism that had followed her through every family gathering for 2 years. 26-year-old Adeline Parker had walked into the Whitmore family with hope in her heart and stars in her eyes. She'd grown up in a small apartment with her grandmother in Detroit, raised on stories about how good people eventually get good things. When Andrew Whitmore, heir to a tech fortune and the kindest man she'd ever met, asked her to marry him, she thought all those stories were finally coming true. She believed in the power of genuine love. She believed that if you treated people with respect and kindness, they'd eventually return it. She believed that family meant protection and acceptance, not conditional tolerance based on your bank account or the color of your skin. She believed that being pregnant with Andrew's child would finally make her a real member of the Whitmore family. She had been so beautifully, heartbreakingly wrong. The Whitmores were old money. Not new money that still remembered hunger. Old money that had been wealthy so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to need anything from anyone. They lived in a world of inherited trust funds and inherited prejudices, where tradition mattered more than human decency and bloodline purity ranked higher than actual character. Andrew had been different. He'd seen past the invisible barriers his family had built around themselves. He'd chosen love over legacy, chose Adeline over their approval. For 2 years, he'd been her shield against their cold disapproval and barely concealed disdain. Now he was gone, and that shield had died with him. The accident happened on a Tuesday. Andrew had been driving home from a late meeting, excited to tell Adeline about a new tech project he'd been developing in secret. The rain had been coming down hard, the roads were slick, and an 18-wheeler ran a red light. He died instantly, the paramedics said. No pain, no suffering. Just there one moment and gone the next. Adeline had been home, making dinner and thinking about baby names, when the police knocked on her door. In the span of 5 minutes, she'd gone from excited newlywed to pregnant widow, from planning a nursery to planning a funeral. The Whitmores had moved quickly after that. Too quickly. At the funeral, Margaret Whitmore had worn black Chanel and tears that dried suspiciously fast when she thought no one was looking. She'd accepted condolences with practiced grace, and spoken about Andrew's legacy with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints. But Adeline had caught the looks, the whispered conversations that stopped whenever she walked by, the way certain family members suddenly couldn't make eye contact. She should have known something was coming. She should have paid more attention to the fact that Margaret's grief seemed to focus more on protecting Andrew's memory than supporting his widow. 3 days after they buried Andrew, Margaret had shown up at the house with papers. Legal papers that proved the house, the cars, even the bank accounts had all been held in the family trust. Papers that showed Andrew's death meant everything reverted to his parents. Papers that left Adeline with exactly nothing. "But I'm his wife," Adeline had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm carrying his child." Margaret's smile had been sharp enough to cut glass. "You were his wife. Now you're just another expense we can't afford." The cruelty had been breathtaking in its casual delivery. Here was a woman who'd just lost her son, standing in front of her daughter-in-law who'd just lost her husband, and somehow making it sound like Adeline was the problem that needed solving. "Andrew would never have wanted this," Adeline had protested. "Andrew isn't here to make decisions anymore." Margaret's voice had carried an edge of satisfaction that made Adeline's stomach turn. "And frankly, dear, he was always too soft-hearted for his own good. Especially when it came to charitable cases." The phrase had hung in the air between them like a slap. Charitable cases. As if Adeline's love for Andrew had been some kind of social welfare program. As if their marriage had been an act of pity rather than genuine connection. Standing there now, 48 hours later, Adeline realized she'd been living in a dream for 2 years. She'd convinced herself that Andrew's love had been enough to protect her from his family's prejudices. She believed that carrying their grandchild would finally earn her a place at their table. Instead, she was learning that some people would rather destroy what they couldn't control than accept what they couldn't understand. Where am I supposed to go? The question came out smaller than she'd intended, tinged with a desperation that made Margaret's smile grow wider. That's really not our concern anymore, is it? Margaret adjusted her pearls with practiced precision. You're young. You're resourceful. I'm sure you'll figure something out. The dismissal was final. Absolute. As if Adeline's entire relationship with Andrew had been reduced to an inconvenient business transaction that was now officially closed. But as Adeline stood there, looking around the house where she'd planned to raise her child, where she'd dreamed of growing old with the man she'd loved, something shifted inside her chest. The grief was still there, the heartbreak still fresh and raw. But underneath it all, something else was beginning to take root. Determination. Because Margaret Whitmore had made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed that because Adeline had come from nothing, she was nothing. She'd assumed that because Adeline had been grateful for Andrew's love, she was helpless without it. She'd assumed that a pregnant widow with no money and no family would simply disappear quietly, taking her inconvenient existence and mixed-race baby somewhere far away from their pristine legacy. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. Adeline had met Andrew Whitmore 3 years earlier at a tech conference in Chicago, back when she'd been working as a junior developer for a small startup that barely paid her enough to cover rent on her studio apartment. She'd been the only black woman in a room full of white men in expensive suits, pitching an app idea that everyone said was too ambitious for someone with her background. Andrew had been different from the start. While other investors had looked through her like she was invisible, he'd actually listened to her presentation. More than that, he'd asked questions that showed he understood not just her code, but her vision for how technology could bridge gaps between communities that had been overlooked by Silicon Valley's typical demographic. Most people see problems, he'd told her over coffee after her presentation. You see solutions. That's rare. She'd fallen for his mind first, then his heart. Andrew Whitmore was brilliant in the way that only came from genuine curiosity about the world. He could spend hours discussing coding algorithms or social justice with equal passion. He read voraciously, donated quietly to causes his family would have found embarrassing, and had never once made Adeline feel like she needed to be anything other than herself. Their relationship had developed slowly, carefully. Andrew had been honest about his family from the beginning, warning her that they had what he diplomatically called traditional values, and what she would later learn meant barely concealed racism wrapped in the language of social propriety. They're going to test you, he'd said during one of their early dates, his hand finding hers across the restaurant table. They test everyone I bring home. But they're going to test you harder because you're not what they expected. Adeline had thought she was prepared for their scrutiny. She'd grown up navigating predominantly white spaces, had learned to code switch between her grandmother's warm, expressive household and the sterile corporate environments where she'd built her career. She'd thought her education, her ambition, her obvious love for their son would eventually win them over. The first time Andrew brought her to the Whitmore estate, she'd been struck by its imposing beauty. The house sat on 20 acres of manicured grounds, all marble columns and floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the Connecticut sky like mirrors. Everything was perfect, pristine, and utterly intimidating. Margaret Whitmore had greeted them at the door wearing what Adeline would later learn was her signature expression. A smile that never quite reached her eyes, polite enough to maintain appearances but cold enough to maintain distance. "So you're the young woman Andrew's been telling us about," Margaret had said, her gaze traveling over Adeline's carefully chosen outfit with the precision of a quality inspector. "How lovely." The word lovely had been delivered with just enough emphasis to make it clear that Margaret found nothing particularly lovely about the situation. Charles Whitmore, Andrew's father, had been more subtle but no less clear in his disapproval. He'd shaken Adeline's hand with the kind of firm grip meant to test her confidence, his pale blue eyes studying her face, as if trying to solve an equation that didn't quite balance. "Andrew tells us you work in technology," Charles had said over dinner, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "How modern." The pause before modern had been loaded with meaning. It was the same tone people used when they said urban or diverse. Words that meant one thing on the surface but carried entirely different implications underneath. But Andrew had been there, his hand warm on her back, his presence a constant reminder that she belonged at that table. When Margaret made passive-aggressive comments about Adeline's career being so demanding for someone planning a family someday, Andrew had smoothly redirected the conversation. When Charles questioned whether her startup had real potential or was just another Silicon Valley fad, Andrew had launched into a detailed explanation of why her work mattered. For 2 years, he'd been her translator in a world that spoke in coded language and inherited prejudices. He'd helped her navigate family dinners where conversations about maintaining standards and preserving tradition were really discussions about keeping outsiders out. He'd stood between her and his family's subtle cruelties with a grace that had made her believe love really could conquer all. The engagement had been a particular battlefield. Margaret had immediately tried to take control of the wedding planning, suggesting venues that would better reflect the family's position, and guest lists that somehow managed to exclude most of Adeline's friends and family. Every decision became a negotiation where Adeline's preferences were politely overruled in favor of what people would expect from a Whitmore wedding. "It's just one day," Andrew had said when Adeline expressed frustration about being steamrolled on every detail. "After that, you'll be family. Things will be different." She'd wanted to believe him. She'd needed to believe that the woman who'd spent their entire engagement subtly criticizing everything from her dress choice to her hair to her unconventional career would somehow transform into a loving mother-in-law once the vows were exchanged. The wedding itself had been everything Margaret wanted and nothing Adeline had dreamed of. The guest list had been full of Whitmore family friends and business associates who looked at Adeline with polite curiosity, as if she were an interesting art piece they weren't quite sure how to interpret. Her own family had been relegated to a few tables in the back, her grandmother looking tiny and uncomfortable in the vast ballroom Margaret had insisted upon. During the reception, Adeline had overheard Margaret talking to her sister near the bar. "Well, she seems nice enough," Margaret's sister had said, glancing toward where Adeline was chatting with some of Andrew's college friends. "Oh, she's perfectly charming," Margaret had replied, her voice carrying that particular tone that made charming sound like a criticism. Andrew's always had a weakness for rescue projects. Remember when he wanted to adopt that stray dog? Same impulse, really. The comparison had stung more than Adeline had expected. Standing there in her wedding dress, surrounded by people who saw her marriage as Andrew's latest charitable endeavor rather than a love story, she'd felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. But Andrew had found her a few minutes later, spinning her around the dance floor with such obvious joy that she'd managed to push the overheard conversation to the back of her mind. This was just his mother's way of processing change. Things would get better once Margaret saw how happy Andrew was. Once she understood that Adeline wasn't trying to take anything away from the family, but rather add something to it. The first year of marriage had been a careful dance of establishing boundaries. Margaret had continued her subtle campaign of criticism disguised as concern. She'd questioned Adeline's decision to keep working after marriage, wondered aloud whether her demanding career would interfere with giving Andrew the children he deserved, and made frequent comments about how different things were in her generation when wives understood their priorities. Charles had been more direct in his disapproval. He'd made it clear that he saw Adeline's presence in the family as a temporary inconvenience that would hopefully resolve itself naturally. He'd excluded her from business discussions, forgotten to invite her to family gatherings, and maintained the kind of polite distance usually reserved for service staff. But there had been moments of hope. Margaret had seemed genuinely excited when Adeline announced her pregnancy, talking about nursery decorations and family traditions with more warmth than she'd shown in 2 years. Charles had even smiled when Andrew had shared their baby news, mentioning how wonderful it would be to have another generation of Whitmores. Looking back now, Adeline realized those moments hadn't been about acceptance or inclusion. They'd been about the baby, the Whitmore heir that would carry on the family name and legacy. She'd been nothing more than a vessel for continuing their bloodline, tolerated only as long as she served that function. The truth had become crystal clear the moment Andrew died. Without him there to shield her, without his constant advocacy and protection, she'd discovered exactly how his family really saw her. Not as Andrew's beloved wife or the mother of their grandchild, but as an outsider who'd temporarily gained access to their world through Andrew's misguided charity. Margaret's mask had slipped completely in the days following the funeral. The polite smiles and diplomatic language had vanished, replaced by cold efficiency and barely concealed contempt. She'd moved through the process of claiming Andrew's assets with the precision of someone who'd been planning for this moment, who'd known exactly what steps to take to remove Adeline from their lives permanently. "We'll be changing the locks tomorrow," Margaret had informed her on that final day, standing in the foyer like a general surveying conquered territory. "Security reasons, you understand. Can't be too careful these days." The dismissal had been so casual, so matter-of-fact, that it had taken Adeline a moment to understand what was happening. After 2 years of marriage, after carrying their grandchild, after grieving their son, she was being treated like a security risk who needed to be contained and removed. "What about my things? What about Andrew's things? Your personal belongings will be packed and delivered to wherever you're staying," Margaret had said with practiced efficiency. "As for Andrew's possessions, those belong to the family now. I'm sure you understand." Standing there with her suitcase and her broken heart, Adeline had finally understood exactly who these people were underneath their polished manners and inherited wealth. They were exactly what Andrew had tried to protect her from, what he'd spent 2 years shielding her from seeing clearly. They were people who would smile at your wedding and calculate your destruction at your husband's funeral. People who could grieve their son while simultaneously punishing his widow for the crime of loving him. People who saw other human beings as either useful assets or inconvenient obstacles, with no middle ground for simple human dignity. But as Margaret's final words echoed in her mind, Adeline realized something else. For 2 years, she'd been trying to earn their acceptance, trying to prove she belonged in their world. She'd twisted herself into smaller and smaller shapes, hoping to fit into the narrow space they'd carved out for her in their family. She was done trying to belong somewhere she was never wanted. Now she had something far more important to focus on: protecting the child growing inside her and honoring the memory of the man who'd loved her exactly as she was. The woman walking out of the Whitmore estate that day was different from the one who'd walked in 3 years earlier, full of hope and naive faith in the power of love to overcome prejudice. This woman understood that sometimes the people who claim to have your best interests at heart are the ones plotting your downfall. This woman had learned that grace and kindness could be weaponized just as effectively as cruelty. This woman was about to discover exactly what she was capable of when she had nothing left to lose. The one-bedroom apartment Adeline found in East Hartford was a far cry from the Whitmore estate. The walls were thin enough to hear her neighbors arguing, the heat barely worked, and the water pressure made showering feel like standing under a leaky faucet. But it was what she could afford with the small savings account she'd maintained separately from Andrew's family money, and more importantly, it was hers. She'd been there for 3 days when the delivery truck arrived. Two men in uniform carried in exactly 4 boxes. Everything Margaret Whitmore had deemed worthy of returning to her. Adeline's clothes, a few books, some photos, and the small jewelry box her grandmother had given her for her 16th birthday. That was it. 2 years of marriage reduced to 4 cardboard boxes that barely filled the corner of her tiny living room. She'd been prepared for that indignity. What she hadn't been prepared for was the envelope tucked inside her jewelry box, hidden beneath the velvet lining where she'd kept her grandmother's wedding ring. The envelope was addressed in Andrew's handwriting. For Adeline, if something happens to me. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter written in Andrew's careful script and a flash drive that felt impossibly light for something that would change her entire life. "My darling Adeline," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and knowing my parents, you're probably discovering exactly who they really are beneath all that polished civility. I'm sorry you're having to face them alone. I'm sorry I can't be there to protect you from what I know they're capable of." Adeline sank onto her second-hand couch, her heart hammering as she continued reading. "I've been working on something in secret for the past year. A project my parents would never understand or support, but something I believe could change everything. It's a technology platform designed to connect underserved communities with resources and opportunities that have traditionally been gatekept by people like my family. I call it Equitech." The letter went on to explain Andrew's vision in detail. He'd been developing an artificial intelligence system that could identify and eliminate bias in hiring processes, loan approvals, educational opportunities, and business investments. It was designed to level playing fields that had been tilted in favor of privilege and against people like Adeline her entire life. "The technical framework is about 60% complete," Andrew had written. "All the research, the initial coding, the beta tests, it's all on that flash drive. But it needs someone who understands both the technology and the problem it's trying to solve. Someone who's lived on both sides of the divide. Someone like you." Adeline's vision blurred as she read the final paragraphs. "I know you didn't marry me to become a tech entrepreneur. I know this isn't the life you planned. But if something happens to me, if my parents try to erase you from our story the way I know they will, please don't let them erase this too. This project isn't just my legacy. It's my love letter to a world where people like you don't have to fight so hard just to get a seat at the table." The flash drive contains everything you need to understand the system, plus contact information for 3 investors who believe in the project but could never work with my family directly. They're waiting for my signal to move forward. That signal is you. I love you, Adeline. I've always loved your brilliance, your resilience, your refusal to accept that things have to stay broken just because they've always been broken. If you're reading this letter, then the world needs that brilliance more than ever. Don't let my family convince you that you're small. You were never small. You were just surrounded by people too limited to see your actual size. The letter was signed simply "Forever yours, Andrew," followed by a postscript that made her laugh despite her tears. "P.S. The password for everything is Adeline changes everything. No space, capital A and C. I always knew you would." Adeline clutched the flash drive like a lifeline, her mind racing through the implications. Andrew had been planning for this moment. He'd known his parents well enough to anticipate their cruelty, and he'd loved her enough to leave her the tools to fight back. But as she plugged the drive into her ancient laptop and began exploring the files Andrew had left her, the magnitude of what he was asking hit her like a physical blow. The technical documentation was incredibly sophisticated. This wasn't some startup pipe dream, but a genuinely revolutionary approach to algorithmic fairness that could disrupt entire industries. It was also completely unfinished. The business plan showed Andrew had projected needing at least $2 million in initial funding to complete development and bring the platform to market. The technical roadmap indicated another 18 months of intensive coding work just to reach a viable beta version. The marketing research suggested they'd be going up against established companies with billions in resources and decades of market dominance. Andrew had left her a masterpiece, but it was a masterpiece that existed only in blueprint form. Actually building it would require skills she wasn't sure she had, money she definitely didn't have, and a level of risk that seemed almost suicidal for a pregnant widow living paycheck to paycheck. She spent the next week diving into Andrew's research, teaching herself the advanced programming concepts she'd need to understand his architecture. Her pregnancy symptoms made the long hours even more challenging. Morning sickness that lasted all day, fatigue that left her barely functional by evening, and the constant underlying stress of wondering how she'd pay next month's rent. But the more she understood Andrew's vision, the more she realized he'd been right about something crucial. She did understand both sides of the problem he was trying to solve. She'd spent her entire career being the only black woman in rooms full of white men who assumed she was there by accident or affirmative action. She'd watched qualified candidates get passed over for opportunities because they didn't fit the cultural fit requirements that were really code for looks like us. She'd seen brilliant ideas dismissed because they came from the wrong kinds of people. Andrew had designed Equitech to make those dismissals impossible. His AI system would force organizations to evaluate people and ideas based purely on merit, stripping away the unconscious biases that had shaped hiring and investment decisions for generations. It was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible, but it was also exactly what the world needed. The 3 investors Andrew had mentioned turned out to be as unconventional as his project. Dr. Sarah Chun was a former Google executive who'd left to start her own venture capital firm focused on social impact technology. Marcus Rodriguez was a serial entrepreneur who'd built and sold 2 companies that specifically served Latino communities. And most surprisingly, Janet Williams was a 70-year-old black woman who'd made her fortune in real estate and was now looking to fund the kind of opportunities she'd been denied in her own career. Adeline's first video call with them was scheduled for a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after she'd found Andrew's letter. She'd prepared for hours, reviewing every detail of the technical documentation, practicing her presentation until she could deliver it flawlessly. But as the call connected and she saw 3 faces looking at her expectantly through her cracked laptop screen, all her preparation felt inadequate. "Mrs. Whitmore," Dr. Chin began, then immediately corrected herself. "I'm sorry, Ms. Parker. Andrew told us so much about you. We were devastated to hear about the accident." "Thank you," Adeline managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. I know Andrew's death changes everything about this project." "Actually," Marcus Rodriguez interrupted, "it might change everything for the better. Andrew was brilliant, but he was also a Whitmore. There are doors that name opened for him, but there are also doors it closed. Communities that would never trust technology coming from that family legacy." Janet Williams nodded in agreement. "Andrew understood the problem intellectually, but you've lived it. That's not a small distinction when we're talking about building technology that's supposed to serve people who've been failed by technology before." The conversation that followed was unlike any business meeting Adeline had ever experienced. Instead of focusing solely on profit projections and market penetration, they talked about impact. They discussed the communities that would benefit most from Equitech's bias detection algorithms. They explored the resistance they'd face from established companies that profited from the current system's inequities. "Here's the truth," Dr. Chen said as the call wound down. "Andrew's technical foundation is solid, but building on it is going to be incredibly difficult. You'll be working 18-hour days for at least 2 years. You'll be going up against competitors who have resources you can't match and connections you can't access. You'll face skepticism from people who think a pregnant widow can't possibly build what Andrew started. And," Marcus added, "you'll be doing all of this while raising a child and probably dealing with Andrew's family trying to sabotage you at every turn. Because make no mistake, once they figure out what you're building, they're going to see it as a threat to everything their world represents." Adeline felt the weight of their warnings, but she also felt something she hadn't experienced since Andrew's death: purpose. For weeks, she'd been focused on simple survival, on making it through each day without falling apart completely. This conversation was the first time she'd thought about actually building something, about creating a future instead of just enduring the present. "I understand the risks," she said quietly, "but I also understand what happens if we don't take them. Andrew saw something in this project that was worth dying for. I think it might be worth living for too." Janet Williams smiled for the first time during the call. "That's exactly what we needed to hear. We're prepared to offer initial funding of $2.5 million, with additional investment rounds as you hit development milestones." But we need to be clear about what we're investing in. We're not just funding a technology platform, Dr. Chen explained. We're backing you. Your vision, your leadership, your ability to build something that serves communities that have been ignored by Silicon Valley for decades. That's not a responsibility we're offering lightly. As the call ended and Adeline closed her laptop, she realized she'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She'd committed to building something that would require every skill she had and several she'd need to learn. She'd accepted responsibility for a project that could either change the world or destroy what little stability she'd managed to create for herself and her unborn child. But for the first time since Andrew's death, she felt like herself again. Not the grateful outsider trying to earn acceptance from the Whitmore family. Not the broken widow living on charity and sympathy. She felt like the woman Andrew had fallen in love with, brilliant, determined, and completely unwilling to accept that broken systems had to stay broken. The next morning, she called her landlord and negotiated a 2-year lease on the apartment. She set up a dedicated workspace in the corner of her bedroom and ordered the computer equipment she'd need to begin serious development work. She made a doctor's appointment to ensure her pregnancy was progressing safely and scheduled it for times that wouldn't interfere with her new 18-hour workdays. Then she did something that surprised even her. She wrote a letter to Margaret Whitmore, not to ask for anything or seek reconciliation, but simply to let her know that the charitable case she'd thrown away was about to honor her son's memory in ways the Whitmore family would never understand. She didn't mail the letter. She kept it in the drawer next to Andrew's flash drive, a promise to herself about the woman she was becoming and the legacy she intended to build. The Margaret Whitmores of the world had spent generations convinced that people like Adeline would always need their permission to succeed. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. But first, she had 18 months of code to write, algorithms to perfect, and a baby to grow. The easy part, deciding to build Equitech, was over. Now came the impossible part, actually building it while the world watched and waited for her to fail. The first trimester had been brutal, but the second trimester brought challenges Adeline hadn't anticipated. As her pregnancy progressed and her belly grew more prominent, she discovered that being a visibly pregnant woman in the tech world came with its own set of obstacles. Video calls became strategic exercises in camera angles and loose clothing. She learned to schedule her most important meetings during the narrow window between morning sickness and afternoon exhaustion. She memorized which chairs and coffee shops provided the best back support and which bathrooms were closest to her usual meeting spots. But the physical challenges paled in comparison to the technical ones. Andrew's code was brilliant, but it was also incomplete in ways that became more apparent the deeper she dug into the architecture. The bias detection algorithms worked beautifully in controlled environments, but real-world data sets were messy, more chaotic than anything Andrew had anticipated in his development timeline. She spent her days teaching herself advanced machine learning concepts that hadn't existed when she'd graduated from college. She spent her nights debugging code that seemed to develop new problems faster than she could solve existing ones. She spent her weekends researching patent applications and market analysis, trying to understand the competitive landscape Andrew had only partially mapped. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult part. She'd lost touch with most of her old friends during her marriage to Andrew, partly due to the social divide between her life and theirs, partly because the Whitmores had kept her so busy with family obligations that maintaining outside relationships had become nearly impossible. Now, working 18-hour days on a project she couldn't fully explain to people who wouldn't understand its importance anyway, she found herself more alone than she'd ever been. Her only regular human contact came through her weekly check-ins with the 3 investors. But even those conversations were becoming increasingly stressful. Each week brought new questions about timeline delays, budget overruns, and technical obstacles that Andrew's original projections hadn't accounted for. The bias detection is working, she explained during a particularly difficult call in her 6th month. But the processing speed is nowhere near what we need for real-time applications. Companies aren't going to adopt a system that slows their hiring process down by 70%. Dr. Chen's voice carried the strain of someone who'd been having similar conversations with other struggling startups. How far behind are we on the original timeline? About 4 months, Adeline admitted. Maybe 6 if we run into any major technical roadblocks. What she didn't tell them was that she was also 4 months behind on her rent and living primarily on peanut butter sandwiches and prenatal vitamins. The initial funding had been generous, but most of it was designated for equipment, software licenses, and contractor payments. Her personal living expenses came from a much smaller allocation that she'd stretched as far as mathematically possible. She'd applied for 3 part-time consulting jobs to supplement her income, but each interview had ended the same way. Initial enthusiasm about her technical skills, followed by visible concern when they noticed her pregnancy, followed by polite rejections citing cultural fit issues or shifting business priorities. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was building a system to eliminate hiring bias while being rejected for jobs because of bias she couldn't prove, but everyone knew was happening. Meanwhile, her former in-laws seemed to be thriving in their post-Andrew world. She'd started following Whitmore Industries' social media accounts and press releases, partly to stay informed about potential competitors, partly because she couldn't quite let go of her connection to Andrew's world. What she discovered made her stomach turn. Margaret Whitmore had launched something called the Andrew Whitmore Memorial Foundation, supposedly dedicated to supporting young entrepreneurs with innovative technology ideas. The foundation's website featured elegant photos of Margaret speaking at industry conferences about her son's passion for innovation and social justice. There were quotes about Andrew's vision for using technology to make the world more equitable, words that sounded suspiciously similar to conversations he'd had with Adeline about Equitech. But the foundation wasn't supporting the kind of entrepreneurs Andrew had actually cared about. The grant recipients were all from prestigious universities, all working on projects that served affluent markets, all representing exactly the kind of privileged innovation ecosystem that Andrew had been trying to disrupt. Margaret had taken Andrew's genuine passion for social justice and turned it into a marketing tool for the same exclusionary system he'd been fighting against. She was using his memory to burnish the family's reputation while ensuring that his actual revolutionary ideas died with him. The press coverage was even worse. Article after article featured Margaret as the grieving mother carrying on her son's legacy, a woman who'd found purpose in tragedy by channeling her loss into supporting the next generation of innovators. She was photographed at charity galas and tech conferences, always wearing Andrew's favorite color blue, always carrying herself with the dignified grace of someone who'd turned personal pain into public service. There was never any mention of Andrew's wife, no reference to his unborn child, no acknowledgement that he'd left behind a pregnant widow who was actually trying to build the thing he'd dreamed of creating. In Margaret Whitmore's version of Andrew's story, Adeline had never existed at all. The erasure was so complete, so thorough, that Adeline began to question her own memories. Had Andrew really been working on Equitech, or had she somehow misunderstood his notes? Had their relationship really been as meaningful as she remembered, or had she been projecting significance onto what had actually been a passing infatuation for him? She found herself rereading Andrew's letter obsessively, checking and rechecking the technical documentation to confirm that it was real, that she hadn't imagined the whole thing during some kind of grief-induced hallucination. The worst part was the growing suspicion that the Whitmores knew exactly what she was trying to build and were actively working to undermine her efforts. She'd started noticing strange patterns in her business activities that seemed too coordinated to be coincidental. Companies that had initially expressed interest in Equitech suddenly stopped returning her calls after she mentioned her last name had been Whitmore. Potential contractors would ghost her after asking detailed questions about her project background. 2 different patent lawyers had taken meetings with her, asked extensive questions about her technology, then declined to represent her, citing conflicts of interest they couldn't specify. When she finally connected with a patent attorney willing to help her, the news was devastating. 3 separate patent applications had been filed in the past 6 months for bias detection algorithms remarkably similar to Andrew's designs. The applications were all filed by shell companies with ties to Whitmore Industries' investment portfolio. It's not uncommon for multiple teams to be working on similar problems, her lawyer had explained. But the technical specifications in these applications are unusually specific. Almost like someone had access to detailed research that gave them a significant head start. The implications hit Adeline like a physical blow. Someone with access to Andrew's research was using it to patent the core innovations that made Equitech revolutionary. If those patents were approved, her entire project would become legally impossible to implement. She'd spent 7 months building something that the Whitmores might be able to destroy with a few strategic legal maneuvers. They'd thrown her out of Andrew's house, erased her from his public legacy, and now they were trying to steal the technology he'd entrusted to her. But the cruelest part was how they were doing it. Instead of confronting her directly, they were systematically destroying her ability to succeed while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. They could claim they'd never heard of her project, never interfered with her business, never done anything but grieve their son and honor his memory through their foundation work. The stress was affecting her pregnancy. She'd started having trouble sleeping, partly because her growing belly made finding comfortable positions difficult, partly because her mind wouldn't stop racing through worst-case scenarios about patent disputes and legal challenges she couldn't afford to fight. Her doctor had already warned her once about elevated blood pressure. She'd been advised to reduce stress and increase rest, advice that felt like a luxury she couldn't afford when every day of delay put her further behind schedule and deeper in debt. At 30 weeks pregnant, she was debugging code at 2 a.m. when she felt the first contraction. It was mild, barely noticeable, but it sent a spike of terror through her chest that had nothing to do with physical pain. If something happened to her baby, if the stress and exhaustion and financial pressure caused her to lose the only connection she had left to Andrew, she would have nothing. No family, no support system, no reason to keep fighting against people who had resources she couldn't match and connections she couldn't access. She closed her laptop and forced herself to lie down, practicing the breathing exercises she'd learned from pregnancy apps since she couldn't afford actual childbirth classes. As she focused on slowing her heart rate and relaxing her muscles, she tried to calculate how much longer she could maintain this pace before something gave. The math was unforgiving. At her current rate of progress, she'd need another 8 months to complete Equitech's core development. But her savings would run out in 6 weeks. The patent challenges could tie up her project for years, even if she won. And her baby was due in 10 weeks, which would eliminate her ability to work 18-hour days, even if she solved every other problem overnight. Meanwhile, Margaret Whitmore was building a public legacy on Andrew's stolen memory, while systematically destroying the project he'd actually cared about. She was being celebrated as a visionary philanthropist while the woman carrying her grandchild was quietly going bankrupt in a 1-bedroom apartment across town. The contractions stopped after 20 minutes, but the message was clear. Her body couldn't sustain this pressure much longer. Her finances couldn't sustain this pressure much longer. Her spirit couldn't sustain this pressure much longer. Something had to change, or everything Andrew had entrusted to her would die along with her will to keep fighting. But as she lay there in the dark, feeling her baby move restlessly in response to her stress, Adeline realized she'd been approaching this all wrong. She'd been trying to build Equitech the way Andrew would have built it, through proper channels, with institutional support, following the rules of a system that was designed to exclude people like her. She'd been playing by their rules in their game, wondering why she kept losing to people who had written the rules specifically to ensure their own victory. Maybe it was time to stop playing their game altogether. Maybe it was time to build something they couldn't steal, couldn't patent, and couldn't control because they'd never see it coming until it was too late to stop. The woman who'd spent months trying to honor Andrew's vision was about to discover that sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory is to surpass it completely. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who has nothing left to lose and everything still to fight for. The Whitmores thought they'd destroyed Adeline Parker when they threw her out of their house and erased her from their story. They had no idea they'd actually just freed her to become someone far more dangerous than the grateful daughter-in-law they'd expected her to remain. But first, she had to survive the next 10 weeks and give birth to the child who would either become her greatest weakness or her most powerful motivation to prove that grace could triumph over cruelty after all. Adeline was 32 weeks pregnant when she discovered the truth about everything. It started with a phone call that came at 3 a.m, waking her from the few hours of sleep she'd managed between debugging sessions. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, nervous, speaking in rushed whispers that suggested someone calling from a place they shouldn't be. Is this Adeline Parker? The woman who was married to Andrew Whitmore. Who is this? Adeline struggled to sit up, her back aching from falling asleep on the couch with her laptop again. My name is Jessica Chin. I work for Whitmore Industries. Worked for them. I just got fired today, but before they escort me out, I thought you should know what they're planning. The words sent ice through Adeline's veins. What are you talking about? I've been working in their legal department for 2 years. I helped process Andrew's estate after he died. Ma'am, they didn't just steal your inheritance. They've been systematically destroying your life for months, and what they're planning next, you need to know. Jessica's story unfolded over the next 20 minutes like a horror movie script. She'd been assigned to monitor Adeline's business activities, tracking her patent applications, her investor meetings, her contractor relationships. Every phone call Adeline made, every email she sent to potential business partners, somehow made its way back to Whitmore Industries within hours. How is that even possible? Adeline's voice came out smaller than she intended. Your phone, your internet, your email, they had access to everything. Andrew had you on the family phone plan, remember? When he died, that account transferred to his parents along with everything else. They've been monitoring your communications this entire time. The revelation hit Adeline like a physical blow. Every private conversation with her investors, every confidential discussion with contractors, every desperate late-night email to potential collaborators. The Whitmores had seen all of it. They'd been watching her struggle while systematically sabotaging her efforts, turning her isolation into entertainment. But that's not the worst part, Jessica continued, her voice shaking. They hired a private investigator 6 weeks ago. They're building a case to prove you're an unfit mother. They want custody of the baby. Adeline's world tilted sideways. What? They've been documenting everything. Your financial situation, your living conditions, your work hours. They have photos of you leaving the apartment at all hours, receipts showing you've been living on processed foods, medical records they somehow accessed showing your elevated blood pressure. They're going to argue that you're endangering the child through stress and neglect. The phone slipped from Adeline's hand as the full scope of their plan became clear. They hadn't just wanted to erase her from Andrew's legacy. They wanted to erase her from her child's life entirely. They planned to take the baby, raise it as a proper Whitmore heir, and eliminate the last trace of her existence from their family story. Ma'am? Are you still there? Adeline picked up the phone with trembling fingers. How do you know all this? Margaret Whitmore has been bragging about it in partners' meetings. She calls it fixing Andrew's mistake. She says once they have custody, they can ensure the child is raised with proper values and education, away from your influence. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Margaret had spent months watching Adeline struggle to honor Andrew's memory, while planning to steal the one thing that made that struggle worthwhile. She'd been playing a long game where Adeline's suffering was just a prelude to complete destruction. There's more, Jessica said quietly. The investors you've been working with? Dr. Chin, Marcus Rodriguez, Janet Williams? They're all on Whitmore Industries Advisory Board. They've been feeding information about your project back to Margaret the entire time. The words hit Adeline like a series of physical blows. The 3 people she'd trusted most, the ones who'd claimed to believe in Andrew's vision and her ability to execute it, had been working for his family all along. Every technical detail she'd shared, every weakness she'd admitted, every vulnerable moment when she'd asked for advice or extension, all of it had gone straight to the people trying to destroy her. They were never going to fund your project, Jessica explained. The whole thing was designed to keep you busy and isolated while they figured out how to legally take the baby. They needed you to stay pregnant and stressed so they could document your decline as evidence of unfitness. Adeline felt something break inside her chest, something that had been holding her together through months of struggle and disappointment. The 3 investors hadn't just betrayed her trust. They'd been the architects of her destruction from the very beginning. Every encouraging word, every strategic suggestion, every moment of seeming support had been carefully calculated manipulation. How long have you known about this? Adeline's voice sounded foreign to her own ears. I started putting pieces together about a month ago, but I couldn't prove anything until today. That's why they fired me. I asked too many questions about the legal fees for the custody case. The room was spinning around Adeline as the implications continued to unfold. She'd spent 7 months believing she was building something meaningful, while actually walking deeper into a trap that had been set the moment Andrew died. Every decision she'd made, every sacrifice she'd endured, every hope she'd held onto had been part of someone else's plan to destroy her. "What evidence do they have?" she managed to ask. Jessica's silence stretched long enough to confirm Adeline's worst fears. "It's extensive. Financial records showing you're barely surviving. Photos of you working until all hours while pregnant. Medical documentation of stress-related complications. Character witnesses who'll testify about your emotional instability after Andrew's death." Character witnesses? People from the Whitmore social circle who'll say you were never really family, that Andrew's relationship with you was a phase he was growing out of before he died. They're going to paint you as someone who trapped him with a pregnancy and is now using the baby to maintain access to wealth you never deserved. The cruelty was so systematic, so thorough, that Adeline found herself almost admiring its completeness. Margaret Whitmore hadn't just wanted to win. She'd wanted to ensure that Adeline never had the strength to fight back. She'd built a case that would not only take away her child, but destroy her reputation so completely that no one would ever believe her version of events. "When are they planning to file?" Adeline asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "As soon as the baby is born. They want to establish custody immediately, before you can bond with the child or build any kind of support system. They're arguing that immediate intervention is necessary to protect the infant from an unstable environment." Adeline closed her eyes and tried to process the magnitude of what she was facing. In less than 8 weeks, she would give birth to Andrew's child. Within days of that birth, his parents would launch a legal campaign designed to prove she was unfit to raise her own baby. They had months of carefully documented evidence, unlimited financial resources, and a legal system that historically favored wealthy white families over struggling single mothers. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked Jessica. "Because I have a 2-year-old daughter, and I can't imagine anyone trying to take her away from me for being poor. Because I've been watching you fight for something you believe in while they've been plotting against you, and it's not right. Because someone should warn you what's coming." After Jessica hung up, Adeline sat in her dark apartment for hours, staring at the wall and trying to understand how completely she'd been played. Every moment of hope over the past 7 months had been an illusion. Every small victory had been allowed to happen only because it served someone else's larger plan to destroy her. The investors' weekly encouragement, their strategic advice, their patient extension of deadlines, all of it had been designed to keep her focused on an impossible project while they gathered evidence of her deteriorating mental and financial state. They'd never intended to help her succeed. They'd been documenting her failure from the beginning. Andrew's letter, his flash drive, his passionate vision for Equitech. Had any of it been real, or was that part of the setup too? Had the love of her life left her a genuine legacy, or had his family somehow orchestrated even that cruel hope? She pulled out Andrew's letter and read it again, looking for signs of deception she'd missed. But his words still rang with authenticity. His technical vision still showed the kind of innovative thinking that had made her fall in love with his mind. If this was fake, it was crafted by someone who understood Andrew better than she had. No, the letter was real. Andrew had genuinely tried to give her something to fight with. But his family had been watching, waiting, turning his gift into another weapon to use against her. As dawn broke outside her window, Adeline felt something shift inside her chest. The grief and betrayal were still there, still raw and overwhelming. But underneath those emotions, something else was growing. Something harder, more focused, more dangerous than anything the Whitmores had anticipated. They'd made one crucial mistake in their elaborate plan. They'd assumed that destroying her hope would destroy her will to fight. They'd believed that isolating her completely would leave her too weak to resist when they came for her child. They'd forgotten that the most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the most resources. It's the one who has nothing left to lose. Adeline Parker had spent 7 months trying to build something within a system designed to exclude her. She'd followed rules written by people who'd never intended to let her win. She'd trusted people who saw her trust as a tool to be exploited. But now she understood exactly who she was dealing with and exactly what they were capable of. She knew their plan, their timeline, their evidence, and their vulnerabilities. For the first time since Andrew's death, she had perfect clarity about what needed to happen next. The woman who'd been trying to honor her husband's vision was about to become someone far more dangerous. Someone who understood that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to destroy what threatens it completely. The Whitmores thought they'd been playing chess while she played checkers. They were about to discover they'd actually been playing a game where the rules were about to change entirely, and the pregnant widow they'd dismissed as a broken opponent was about to reveal exactly what 7 months of systematic torture had taught her about the difference between justice and revenge. But first, she had exactly 8 weeks to build something they'd never see coming. 8 weeks to turn their own weapons against them. 8 weeks to prove that underestimating a woman with nothing left to lose was the kind of mistake that destroyed legacies and redefined what was possible. The real battle was about to begin, and this time, Adeline knew exactly who her enemies were. The eviction notice came 3 days after Jessica's phone call. Adeline stared at the official document taped to her door, her 8-month pregnant belly making it difficult to lean close enough to read the fine print. 30 days to vacate for lease violations and unpaid rent. She'd been exactly 4 days late on her payment, something she'd cleared up the previous week when her freelance contract payment finally came through. But somehow, those 4 days had been enough to trigger an eviction process that normally took months to initiate. She called her landlord immediately, her hands shaking as she dialed. "Mr. Peterson, there's been a mistake. I paid the rent in full last week. I have the receipt. Ms. Parker." His voice carried an uncomfortable formality that hadn't been there during their previous conversations. "I'm afraid the situation has become complicated. I've received some concerning information about activities being conducted in the apartment that violate the lease agreement." "What activities?" "I work from home on my computer. That's not illegal. I've been informed that you're operating an unlicensed business from the premises, conducting meetings with investors and contractors in violation of the residential-only clause in your lease. I'm also concerned about the noise complaints from neighbors regarding late-night phone calls and equipment running at all hours." Each word felt like a nail being driven into a coffin. Adeline had been careful to keep her business activities minimal and quiet. The only meetings she'd conducted were video calls on her laptop. The only equipment was her computer and a small printer. The noise complaints were impossible since she'd barely spoken above a whisper during her late-night work sessions, terrified of disturbing anyone. "Mr. Peterson, I think someone has given you false information about what I'm doing here. If you could just—" "I'm sorry, Ms. Parker. The decision has been made. You have 30 days to find alternative housing." The line went dead, leaving Adeline standing in her tiny apartment that suddenly felt like a trap closing around her. Someone had gotten to her landlord, fed him lies designed to make her eviction seem justified and unavoidable. Someone who knew exactly when she'd be most vulnerable and least able to fight back. The timing was surgical in its precision. 8 months pregnant, financially struggling, legally naive, and now facing homelessness with less than a month to find alternative housing in a market where most landlords wouldn't rent to a pregnant woman without steady income. She spent the next week calling every apartment complex, rental agency, and private landlord within 50 miles. The conversations followed a predictable pattern. Initial interest based on her credit score and references, followed by uncomfortable silence when they learned about her pregnancy and employment situation, followed by polite rejections citing other qualified applicants or changing availability. By the 3rd week, she'd expanded her search to include studio apartments, basement rooms, and shared housing situations that would barely provide enough space for her and a newborn. Even those options evaporated once potential landlords did whatever background checks they were running on her. It wasn't until she overheard a leasing agent whispering into his phone that she understood what was happening. "Yeah, it's her. The Whitmore situation. Right, we definitely don't want to get involved in that legal mess. Thanks for the heads up." They weren't just rejecting her based on her financial situation. Someone was actively warning rental properties away from her, painting her as a legal liability that would bring unwanted attention and potential lawsuits. The Whitmores weren't just building a custody case. They were ensuring she'd be homeless when they filed it. With 10 days left on her eviction notice and no housing prospects, Adeline's stress levels reached a breaking point her body couldn't sustain. She was debugging code at midnight when the contractions started, sharp and regular enough to send her stumbling to her phone. The emergency room at Hartford Hospital was a fluorescent-lit nightmare of waiting and uncertainty. The doctor who examined her was professionally kind but blunt about the situation. "You're showing signs of preterm labor at 34 weeks. We've managed to stop the contractions for now, but your blood pressure is dangerously elevated and you're showing symptoms of severe stress-induced complications. Is the baby okay?" It was the only question that mattered. "For now, yes. But if you continue at this stress level, we're looking at potential premature delivery, low birth weight, and developmental complications that could affect the child for life." The doctor's next words hit like physical blows. "Ms. Parker, I need to ask about your home situation. Are you experiencing any instability in housing, finances, or family support that might be contributing to this stress level?" The question felt like a trap. Answer honestly, and she'd be admitting to exactly the kind of instability that would support a custody challenge. Lie, and she'd be putting her baby at risk by not addressing the root cause of her medical crisis. "I'm between housing situations right now," she admitted quietly. "I see." The doctor made notes that felt ominous in their careful precision. "Ms. Parker, I'm required to document any environmental factors that could affect maternal and fetal health. Are you currently homeless?" The word hung in the air between them like an accusation. Homeless. She wasn't homeless yet, but in 10 days she would be. Homeless, pregnant, and facing a custody battle against people with unlimited resources and a medical record that would now document her inability to provide stable housing for her child. "I have temporary housing for another week and a half," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "And after that?" The silence stretched long enough to become an answer itself. The doctor's expression shifted to something between sympathy and professional obligation. "Ms. Parker, I need to be honest with you. If you deliver while experiencing housing instability, hospital protocol requires us to contact social services to ensure proper discharge planning for the infant. That's not a threat. It's a safety measure designed to protect both you and the baby." But it sounded like a threat. It sounded like another piece of evidence that would end up in the Whitmores' custody filing. Another example of her inability to provide the stable environment their grandchild deserved. She was discharged with strict instructions to reduce stress, increase rest, and maintain regular prenatal care. Instructions that felt like cruel jokes given her actual circumstances. How was she supposed to reduce stress while facing eviction? How was she supposed to increase rest while searching desperately for housing? How was she supposed to maintain prenatal care when every medical interaction created more evidence for the custody case building against her? The final blow came 2 days later when her last potential housing option fell through. A woman named Carol had initially agreed to rent Adeline a small room in her house, sympathetic to the situation and willing to work with her limited budget. But when Adeline arrived to sign the rental agreement, Carol's demeanor had changed completely. "I'm sorry, but I've decided not to rent the room after all," Carol said, avoiding eye contact as she spoke. "Did someone call you?" Adeline asked, though she already knew the answer. Carol's uncomfortable silence confirmed what Adeline had suspected. The Whitmores' reach extended even to individual homeowners willing to help a pregnant woman in crisis. They'd made sure every door would close, every option would disappear, every potential source of stability would vanish just when she needed it most. With 5 days left before eviction and no alternatives remaining, Adeline faced the reality that she would be giving birth to Andrew's child while literally homeless. She'd be delivering her baby in a hospital where social services would immediately question her fitness as a parent, where every medical decision would be scrutinized through the lens of her housing instability. She spent her last night in the apartment packing her few possessions into the same suitcase she'd carried out of the Whitmore estate 9 months earlier. The circle felt complete in the cruelest possible way. She'd started this journey with nothing but hope and determination. She was ending it with even less: no home, no support system, no financial resources, and a medical record that documented her complete breakdown under pressure. The Equitech project files sat on her laptop like a monument to naivety. She'd spent 9 months believing she could honor Andrew's memory while building something revolutionary. Instead, she'd walked directly into a trap that used her own ambition and love against her, turning her greatest strengths into weapons for her own destruction. At 35 weeks pregnant, Adeline Parker found herself sitting on a park bench at dawn with everything she owned in a single suitcase, watching her phone battery die as she tried to call homeless shelters that couldn't accommodate pregnant women or had waiting lists that stretched for months. The woman who'd once believed that grace and determination could triumph over cruelty was learning that sometimes the world was exactly as harsh as it appeared to be. Sometimes the people with power used that power to destroy anyone who threatened their version of how things should be. Sometimes love and hope and hard work weren't enough to overcome systematic destruction by people who had more resources and fewer scruples. But as the sun came up over Hartford and Adeline felt her baby move restlessly in response to her stress, she realized that the Whitmores had made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that breaking her spirit would guarantee their victory. They'd believed that reducing her to complete desperation would eliminate her ability to fight back. They'd forgotten that sometimes the most dangerous moment in any battle is when your opponent has absolutely nothing left to lose. Sometimes rock bottom isn't the end of the story. It's the foundation for something they never saw coming. The pregnant woman sitting on that park bench looked defeated, destroyed, completely overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. But inside her mind, something was crystallizing that would change everything. A clarity born of complete desperation. A focus that came only from having every other option stripped away. The Whitmores thought they'd won by reducing her to homelessness and despair. They had no idea they'd just freed her from the last vestiges of playing by rules that were designed to ensure her failure. The real war was about to begin, and this time, Adeline understood exactly what she was fighting for and exactly what she was willing to sacrifice to win. Adeline had been sleeping in her car for 3 nights when the parking ticket appeared on her windshield. $25 she didn't have for overnight parking in a lot she'd thought was free. She sat in the driver's seat at 6 in the morning, 35 weeks pregnant and running on maybe 4 hours of sleep, staring at the pink slip that represented the difference between eating that day or going hungry. She was calculating whether she could afford to ignore the ticket when someone knocked on her passenger window. The woman standing outside looked to be in her 60s, African American, wearing scrubs that suggested she was either starting or ending a hospital shift. Her expression was concerned but not pitying, curious rather than judgmental. Adeline rolled down the window, bracing herself for another conversation about loitering or safety regulations that would force her to find yet another place to park. "Honey, you okay? I've seen you here the past few nights, and with you being this pregnant." The woman's voice carried the kind of maternal authority that made lying feel impossible. "I'm fine," Adeline started, then caught herself. She was clearly not fine. She was homeless, broke, and about to give birth in circumstances that would provide perfect ammunition for a custody battle. "Actually, no. I'm not fine at all." The woman's name was Rosa Martinez, and she'd been a labor and delivery nurse at Hartford Hospital for 32 years. She'd seen enough desperate pregnant women to recognize one in crisis, and enough bureaucratic cruelty to understand when someone was being systematically destroyed by forces beyond their control. "You hungry?" Rosa asked, and when Adeline nodded, she gestured toward a small diner across the street. "Come on. Coffee's terrible, but the breakfast is decent and it's warm inside." Sitting in a cracked vinyl booth with a plate of eggs she couldn't afford but was too hungry to refuse, Adeline found herself telling Rosa everything. The story poured out in fragments: Andrew's death, the Whitmore's betrayal, the fake investors, the systematic destruction of every opportunity she'd tried to create. Rosa listened without interrupting, occasionally refilling Adeline's coffee cup or pushing the plate closer when she stopped eating to explain another devastating detail. When Adeline finally finished talking, Rosa sat quietly for a long moment, processing what she'd heard. "How far along are you?" 35 weeks. "And when's the last time you had prenatal care?" Adeline's silence answered that question. She'd missed her last 2 appointments because she couldn't afford the copays, and because every medical interaction created more documentation of her instability. "Listen to me carefully," Rosa said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades advocating for women in impossible situations. These people have been playing a long game, but they made one crucial mistake. They assumed you'd keep playing by their rules. What do you mean? They've been using the system against you, legal systems, financial systems, social systems that were designed to benefit people like them and exclude people like you. But there's something they don't understand about systems. Rosa leaned forward, her eyes intense with the kind of focus that came from years of fighting bureaucratic battles. Every system has loopholes. Every game has rules that work both ways. Every advantage they think they have also creates vulnerabilities they don't see. The question is whether you're ready to stop playing defense and start playing offense. Adeline felt something shift in her chest, a spark of possibility she'd thought was completely extinguished. What kind of offense? The kind where you use their own weapons against them. The kind where you stop trying to build something they can steal and start building something they can't control. The kind where you turn their systematic destruction of your life into the foundation for something they never saw coming. Rosa pulled out her phone and showed Adeline a news article about a tech startup that had just been acquired for $2 billion. The founder was a 28-year-old woman who'd built the company while living in her car, coding in coffee shops and libraries because she couldn't afford office space. She didn't build it the traditional way, Rosa explained. She built it in pieces, using open-source platforms and distributed networks that nobody could shut down or steal. By the time the established companies realized what she was doing, she owned market share they couldn't compete with. The article detailed how the founder had deliberately avoided traditional funding sources and patent protections, instead building her technology through collaborative networks that made it impossible for any single entity to control or destroy. But how does that help me? I don't have the resources to. Honey, you don't need traditional resources. You need to stop thinking like someone who's trying to earn permission from people who never intended to give it to you. Rosa's voice carried the patience of someone who'd had this conversation before. You've been trying to honor your husband's vision by building exactly what he designed. But what if honoring his vision means taking it further than he ever imagined? That afternoon, Rosa drove Adeline to a community center in East Hartford where a group called Code for Change met every week. It was a collective of programmers, designers, and activists who worked on technology projects designed to serve underrepresented communities. The group met in a basement room that smelled like coffee and possibility. About 15 people sat around folding tables with laptops and tablets, ranging in age from teenagers to retirees, representing every ethnicity and background Adeline could identify. "This is Adeline," Rosa announced to the group. "She's got a project that could change everything, but she's been trying to build it the wrong way." Over the next 2 hours, Adeline explained Equiteca's vision to the most engaged audience she'd encountered in months. Unlike her meetings with the fake investors, these conversations focused on impact rather than profit, on serving communities rather than impressing markets. A 19-year-old named Marcus immediately understood the bias detection algorithms and started sketching modifications that would make them more effective. A woman named Janet, who'd spent 20 years in corporate HR, identified specific pain points in hiring processes that Equitec could address. A retired software engineer named David outlined approaches for building distributed systems that couldn't be controlled by any single corporate entity. "The mistake you made," David explained, "was trying to build this as a traditional startup. Traditional startups can be bought, stolen, or destroyed by people with more resources. But if you build it as an open-source platform with distributed ownership, it becomes unstoppable." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. Like Bitcoin or Wikipedia. Once it reaches critical mass, nobody can shut it down because nobody controls it completely. The group spent the evening redesigning Equitec from the ground up. Instead of a proprietary platform owned by a single company, they envisioned a collaborative network where multiple organizations could implement bias detection tools while contributing to an ever-improving shared database. Instead of seeking traditional venture capital, they outlined a funding model based on micro-investments from the communities that would benefit most from the technology. Instead of competing with established companies, they designed a system that would make traditional hiring and lending practices obsolete. "It's bigger than what your husband originally imagined," Janet said as the meeting wound down. But it's also more powerful because it can't be stopped the way traditional businesses can be stopped. By the time Adeline left the community center, she had commitments from 12 programmers who wanted to work on the project, 3 organizations willing to beta test the bias detection algorithms, and a completely new understanding of what Andrew had actually left her. He hadn't just left her a technology platform. He'd left her a vision for justice that could be implemented in ways that made traditional power structures irrelevant. The Equitech she'd been trying to build was Andrew's version of revolution. The Equitech this group wanted to build was her own. That night, sleeping in Rosa's guest room for the first time in a week, Adeline faced the choice that would define everything that came next. She could continue trying to build Andrew's dream the way he'd envisioned it, hoping to eventually earn recognition and success from people who would never willingly give either to someone like her. Or she could take his vision and transform it into something that couldn't be stolen, controlled, or destroyed because it belonged to everyone and no one simultaneously. She could keep playing defense against people who'd been systematically destroying her life, or she could start playing an entirely different game where their advantages became irrelevant. The choice felt impossibly huge and remarkably simple at the same time. Stay broken or fight back. Accept their narrative or rewrite it completely. Remain a victim of their system or become the architect of a new one. At 35 weeks pregnant, homeless and supposedly defeated, Adeline Parker made the decision that would change not just her own life, but the entire landscape of how technology could serve justice. She chose to stop asking for permission from people who'd never intended to give it. She chose to stop building things that could be stolen by people who'd never created anything themselves. She chose to stop fighting their battle on their terms and start fighting her own battle on terms they'd never understand. The woman who'd spent 9 months trying to honor her husband's memory was about to discover that sometimes the greatest honor you can give someone is to surpass them completely. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is take what they gave you and transform it into something they never dreamed was possible. The Whitmores thought they'd destroyed her by taking away everything traditional success required. They had no idea they'd just forced her to discover a path to success they couldn't control, couldn't steal, and couldn't stop. The real revolution was about to begin, and this time, Adeline knew exactly what she was building and exactly why it would be unstoppable. But first, she had 4 weeks to give birth to her daughter and prove that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to stay defeated by people who think breaking you was their victory. 18 months after giving birth to her daughter Maya in Rosa Martinez's guest bedroom, Adeline Parker stepped out of a black Tesla in front of the Connecticut Convention Center, wearing a charcoal gray suit that cost more than her old monthly rent. The woman who'd once been homeless and pregnant now moved with the confident grace of someone who'd learned exactly what she was capable of when the world tried to destroy her. The banner above the convention center entrance read, "Andrew Whitmore Memorial Foundation Gala, Celebrating Innovation for Social Justice." Margaret Whitmore's latest publicity triumph, an annual event that had become Connecticut's premier networking opportunity for tech executives and social justice advocates. Of course, it had nothing to do with actual social justice. The foundation's grant recipients were all safely conventional projects that posed no threat to existing power structures. But it had successfully rehabilitated the Whitmore family's reputation after the unfortunate publicity around their son's choice of wife. Adeline had been watching Margaret's foundation for months, waiting for exactly the right moment to make her appearance. Tonight's gala was perfect. 500 of Connecticut's most influential people, live streaming to social media, and Margaret Whitmore as the evening's keynote speaker discussing her son's legacy of using technology to help the disadvantaged. The irony was about to become delicious. "Are you ready for this?" Rosa asked from the passenger seat. She'd become Adeline's fiercest advocate over the past year, helping with childcare during the 18-hour workdays that had transformed Code for Change from a basement meeting into a distributed network that was quietly revolutionizing how technology served justice. "I've been ready for this moment since the day they threw me out," Adeline replied, checking her phone one final time. The live stream from inside the gala showed Margaret at the podium, radiant in her role as grieving mother turned social justice champion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret's voice carried through the phone's speaker, My son Andrew believed that technology should serve all people, not just the privileged few. That's why this foundation exists, to ensure that his vision of equity and inclusion continues to change lives. Adeline almost laughed at the audacity. Margaret Whitmore talking about equity while standing on a stage paid for by the systematic destruction of the woman who'd actually built Andrew's vision into reality. But tonight that would end. Over the past 18 months, while Margaret had been celebrating herself as a social justice philanthropist, Adeline had been quietly building something that was changing the world in ways Margaret couldn't comprehend. The distributed version of Equitech had been implemented by 47 organizations across 12 countries. Its bias detection algorithms had identified and eliminated discriminatory practices in hiring, lending, college admissions, and criminal justice systems. More importantly, it had generated enough revenue through ethical licensing agreements to make Adeline independently wealthy. Not Whitmore-level wealthy, but wealthy enough to never again be vulnerable to people who thought money was the only measure of power. Forbes had noticed. Just that morning, the magazine had published its list of 30 under 30 social impact entrepreneurs, with Adeline Parker featured as the cover story. The pregnant widow who revolutionized tech justice sat on newsstands across the country, telling the story of a woman who'd built a billion-dollar social impact platform while homeless and fighting for custody of her daughter. Margaret Whitmore had no idea that story existed yet. She was about to find out in the most public way possible. Adeline walked through the convention center's marble lobby, past displays celebrating the Andrew Whitmore Foundation's supposed achievements. Photos of scholarship recipients who all looked remarkably similar, grand announcements for projects that served wealthy communities while claiming to help disadvantaged ones, and everywhere, Margaret Whitmore's carefully crafted image as a woman who'd transformed personal tragedy into public service. The ballroom was exactly what Adeline had expected: crystal chandeliers, round tables draped in white linen, and 500 people who represented Connecticut's power structure in all its privileged, predominantly white glory. She recognized faces from Andrew's funeral, people who'd offered empty condolences while undoubtedly discussing how quickly the family could move past his unfortunate marriage. Margaret was in the middle of her speech, describing Andrew's passion for social justice with the kind of practiced emotion that suggested she'd given this talk many times before. Andrew understood that true innovation comes from including voices that have been historically excluded, Margaret said, her voice carrying perfect conviction about words that had probably been written by a public relations firm. He believed in the power of technology to bridge divides and create opportunities for those who need them most. Adeline made her way to the back of the ballroom, noting the scattered phones recording Margaret's performance for social media. Perfect. Everything that happened next would be preserved and shared across platforms within minutes. She waited until Margaret reached the climax of her speech, the moment where she always talked about continuing Andrew's work through the Foundation's partnerships with innovative young entrepreneurs who share his vision. That's when Adeline stepped forward into the light. "Excuse me, Mrs. Whitmore." Her voice carried clearly across the ballroom's sound system. Every head turned toward the back of the room, conversations stopping mid-sentence as 500 people tried to identify the woman who'd just interrupted the evening's keynote address. Margaret's face went through a series of expressions in the span of seconds: confusion, recognition, and finally, barely controlled panic as she realized who was standing in her carefully orchestrated celebration. "I think there's been some confusion about Andrew's legacy," Adeline continued, walking slowly down the center aisle as conversations erupted around her, "and about who's actually been building the technology he dreamed of creating." Margaret gripped the podium with white knuckles, her practiced composure cracking as she faced the woman she'd tried to destroy standing confidently in designer clothes that suggested wealth Margaret hadn't authorized. "Security," Margaret said into the microphone, trying to maintain control of the situation. "Oh, I don't think you want security involved right now," Adeline replied, reaching the front of the ballroom and turning to face the audience. "Not when these lovely people are about to learn the truth about what you did to your son's pregnant widow and the project he actually left behind." The room had gone completely silent except for the soft clicking of phones recording what was clearly about to become the evening's most memorable moment. Adeline pulled out her own phone and connected it to the ballroom's presentation system. Within seconds, the large screens around the room displayed the Forbes magazine cover featuring her face above the headline, "How a Homeless Pregnant Widow Built a Billion-Dollar Platform for Justice." The gasps from the audience were audible. "My name is Adeline Parker," she announced, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd learned exactly what she was worth. "Some of you might remember me as Andrew Whitmore's wife, the woman who was thrown out of his house 3 days after his funeral, while pregnant with his child, by the same family that's now claiming to honor his memory." Margaret tried to interrupt, but Adeline continued seamlessly. "For the past 18 months, while Mrs. Whitmore has been giving speeches about Andrew's vision for social justice, I've been actually building what he designed. Equitech is now operational in 47 organizations across 12 countries, eliminating bias in hiring, lending, and criminal justice systems. It's generated over $2 billion in social impact value, and yes, it's made me independently wealthy." She clicked to the next slide, showing a map of Equitech's global implementation. Each red dot represented an organization using bias detection algorithms to create more equitable opportunities for underrepresented communities. "But this isn't really about money or success," Adeline continued, her eyes finding Margaret's terrified face. "This is about truth. About what really happened to Andrew's widow and the systematic campaign to destroy her life." The next slide showed a timeline of events following Andrew's death. Eviction notices, rejected rental applications, severed business relationships, and medical records documenting stress-induced pregnancy complications. "Mrs. Whitmore didn't just steal my inheritance and throw me out homeless while pregnant. She spent months sabotaging every opportunity one tried to create, using private investigators to build a custody case while I was sleeping in my car." Adeline clicked to recordings that Jessica Chun had made before being fired from Whitmore Industries' legal department. Margaret's voice filled the ballroom, discussing plans to document Adeline's decline and prove unfitness to raise Andrew's child. "We need to ensure she's completely destabilized by the time the baby is born," Margaret's recorded voice explained with chilling matter-of-factness. "The more desperate she becomes, the stronger our custody case will be." The audience's reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps, murmurs of horror, and the sound of chairs scraping as people turned to stare at Margaret with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. But Adeline wasn't finished. "The most cruel part," she continued, "was the fake investors. Dr. Sarah Chun, Marcus Rodriguez, and Janet Williams, the 3 people I trusted most, were all working for Whitmore Industries, feeding information about my project back to the family while pretending to support Andrew's vision." She played recordings of Margaret bragging about the elaborate deception, laughing about how easy it had been to manipulate someone desperate enough to trust people who claimed to believe in her dead husband's dreams. They took Andrew's genuine passion for justice and turned it into a marketing tool while systematically destroying the woman who was actually trying to build what he'd designed. They used his memory to enhance their reputation while erasing his wife and child from his story completely. The ballroom had erupted in conversations, with people pulling out phones to verify the Forbes article and search for more information about Equitech. Margaret stood frozen at the podium, her carefully constructed public persona collapsing in real time. "But here's what Margaret Whitmore never understood about justice," Adeline said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived everything they'd thrown at her and emerged stronger. "You can't destroy it by destroying the people who fight for it. You can only delay it until someone builds it in ways you never imagined." She clicked to the final slide, a photo of herself holding 18-month-old Maya, both of them smiling in the office of the Code for Change Foundation that now employed 47 people and had sparked similar organizations in 6 other cities. Andrew's daughter is healthy, happy, and growing up in a world where technology serves justice instead of perpetuating inequality. That's his real legacy. That's what love looks like when it's channeled into action instead of exploitation. The audience erupted in applause that started scattered and built to sustained ovation. People were standing, clapping, and many were wiping tears as they processed what they'd just witnessed. Margaret Whitmore, the woman who'd spent 18 months positioning herself as a champion of social justice while privately plotting the destruction of her son's family, stood completely exposed in front of Connecticut's most influential community. But Adeline had one more surprise. "Mrs. Whitmore, there's something else you should know," she said as the applause died down. 3 days ago, the Connecticut Attorney General's office opened an investigation into fraudulent charity practices based on evidence provided by former Whitmore Industries employees. The Andrew Whitmore Memorial Foundation is being audited for misuse of funds and false representation of charitable activities. Margaret's face went completely white. It turns out that using your dead son's name to raise money while actively destroying his actual legacy is considered fraud in Connecticut. Who knew? As security finally arrived, not to escort Adeline out, but to deal with the media frenzy that was erupting as news outlets picked up the story, Margaret Whitmore's carefully constructed world began its final collapse. The woman who'd thought she could erase Adeline from her son's story was about to discover that sometimes the people you try to destroy come back stronger, richer, and with enough evidence to ensure that your version of events becomes a cautionary tale about the consequences of underestimating someone with nothing left to lose. But the most beautiful part wasn't Margaret's public humiliation or the legal consequences she was facing. It was the knowledge that Andrew's daughter would grow up in a world where her mother had transformed systematic oppression into systematic justice, where love had triumphed over cruelty not through forgiveness, but through the kind of success that made forgiveness irrelevant. The night Margaret Whitmore had planned to celebrate her son's legacy became the night everyone learned who was actually honoring it. And the pregnant widow she dismissed as a broken obstacle had just proven that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who rebuilds herself into something you never saw coming. 6 months after the convention center confrontation that ended Margaret Whitmore's carefully constructed public persona, Adeline Parker stood in the spacious kitchen of her new house in West Hartford, watching 2-year-old Maya toddle around the hardwood floors with the fearless confidence that came from never doubting she was loved and wanted. The house was nothing like the Whitmore estate's cold marble grandeur. It was warm, filled with natural light and the comfortable chaos that came from being an actual home rather than a showcase for inherited wealth. Maya's toys scattered across the living room, photographs of Andrew smiled from every room, and the walls displayed framed articles about Equiteca's global impact alongside Maya's finger-painted masterpieces. It was the kind of house Andrew would have loved, designed for living rather than impressing, built on success that served justice rather than perpetuating inequality. The legal consequences for Margaret Whitmore had unfolded with the methodical precision of a system finally working the way it was supposed to. The Connecticut Attorney General's investigation had uncovered not just fraudulent charity practices, but a pattern of financial manipulation that stretched back years. The Andrew Whitmore Memorial Foundation had been dissolved, its remaining funds redirected to organizations that actually served the communities Margaret had claimed to help. Margaret herself faced federal charges for wire fraud and conspiracy, charges that carried potential prison sentences that would ensure she spent her remaining years experiencing the kind of powerlessness she'd inflicted on others. Charles Whitmore had quietly settled civil lawsuits that prevented even worse revelations about the family's business practices from becoming public record. But the most satisfying consequence wasn't legal punishment. It was irrelevance. The Whitmore family name, once synonymous with Connecticut power and prestige, had become associated with cruelty and fraud. Their social circles had evaporated, their business relationships had dissolved, and their carefully cultivated reputation had been replaced by the kind of public disgust usually reserved for the most despicable forms of abuse. Margaret Whitmore had spent decades believing that wealth and connections made her untouchable. She discovered that reputation built on lies crumbled quickly when the truth was revealed by someone who understood how to use social media, investigative journalism, and legal accountability as weapons for justice. Meanwhile, Equitec had continued growing in ways that exceeded even Adeline's ambitious projections. The platform now operated in 73 countries, had eliminated measurable bias in over 2 million hiring decisions, and had created economic opportunities worth more than $8 billion for previously underserved communities. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real impact lived in individual lives that had been changed by technology that finally served justice instead of perpetuating inequality. Women who got jobs they were qualified for instead of being passed over for cultural fit concerns. Black entrepreneurs who received business loans based on actual creditworthiness rather than discriminatory algorithms. Students who gained college admissions through merit rather than inherited advantage. Each success story represented Andrew's vision made real, but implemented in ways that honored his memory while transcending his original limitations. He'd imagined Equitech as a traditional company that would compete with existing systems. Adeline had built it as a distributed network that made existing systems obsolete. The Code for Change Foundation had become the central hub for this work, employing 127 people across 8 cities and serving as an incubator for social justice technology projects that addressed everything from housing discrimination to medical care bias. Rosa Martinez served as the foundation's chief operations officer, bringing 3 decades of healthcare advocacy experience to ensure their work remained grounded in real community needs. Dr. Sarah Chun, Marcus Rodriguez, and Janet Williams had all faced their own consequences for their roles in the elaborate deception. Professional sanctions from their respective industries, civil lawsuits that had resulted in substantial financial penalties, and the kind of professional ostracism that made continuing their careers in social impact investing impossible. But perhaps the most meaningful development had been completely unexpected. 6 weeks after the convention center revelation, Adeline had received a letter from Jessica Chun, the former Whitmore Industries employee who'd risked her own career to warn Adeline about the custody plot. Jessica had been blacklisted from legal employment in Connecticut after her termination, but Adeline had hired her as Equitech's general counsel. Her insider knowledge of corporate legal tactics had proven invaluable in protecting the platform from attempts by established companies to duplicate or destroy its bias detection capabilities. Justice isn't just about punishing people who do wrong, Jessica had explained during one of their strategic planning meetings. It's about creating systems where doing wrong becomes impossible and doing right becomes profitable. That philosophy had become central to everything Equitech represented. Instead of simply identifying and calling out bias, the platform made bias detection so seamless and profitable that organizations adopted it voluntarily. Instead of shaming companies into better practices, it made better practices the most efficient path to success. The approach had attracted attention from unexpected places. 3 major universities were implementing Equitech protocols in their admissions processes. 12 state governments were piloting bias detection in their hiring and contracting decisions. The European Union had reached out about continent-wide implementation in criminal justice algorithms. But the most personally meaningful recognition had come from a place Adeline had never expected. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had invited her to deliver their keynote address at their annual convention, recognizing Equitech as the most significant advancement in civil rights technology since the internet itself. Standing at that podium, looking out at an audience of people who'd fought for justice long before technology made those fights easier, Adeline had felt the full weight of what Andrew's love had made possible. He'd given her the technical foundation, but she'd built something that honored not just his memory, but the broader struggle for equality that had created the opportunities they'd both been able to access. Now, watching Maya play in their sunlit kitchen while preparing lunch for the weekly Code for Change planning meeting, Adeline reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 18 months ago, she'd been homeless and pregnant, facing a custody battle against people who had infinite resources and no scruples about using them to destroy an inconvenient reminder of their son's choices. Today, she was financially secure in ways that made the Whitmore fortune seem small by comparison. More importantly, she was part of a community that had been built around shared values rather than inherited privilege, surrounded by people who saw justice as a goal worth achieving rather than an obstacle to overcome. Maya would grow up knowing that her mother had transformed the worst moments of her life into something that served millions of people. She'd understand that love wasn't just about personal happiness, but about channeling personal pain into public good. She'd see that strength wasn't measured by how much you could take from others, but by how much you could give to people who needed what you'd learned to create. The doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of the weekly planning meeting participants. Rosa came through the front door carrying homemade empanadas, followed by Marcus and Janet with laptops, and the kind of excited energy that came from working on projects that mattered. David brought his teenage daughter, who'd started interning with the Foundation's youth coding program. Jessica arrived with case law research about international implementations of bias detection technology. These people had become Adeline's chosen family, the community she'd built to replace the one that had rejected her. They gathered around her dining room table to plan technology projects that would serve justice, but the conversations were punctuated with Maya's laughter, stories about their own families, and the easy intimacy that came from working together toward goals that transcended individual success. Andrew had given Adeline the foundation for Equitech, but this community had given her something even more valuable. They'd proven that families could be chosen rather than inherited, that success could serve communities rather than just individuals, and that the most powerful response to systemic cruelty was systematic kindness implemented through technology that made kindness profitable. As the afternoon meeting transitioned into an impromptu dinner party, with Maya charming everyone while Rosa and Janet argued good-naturedly about the best approaches for expanding Equitech into Latin American markets, Adeline felt something she'd never experienced during her marriage to Andrew. Complete peace with who she was and what she'd built. She'd spent her marriage trying to earn acceptance from people who would never see her as anything more than an inconvenient outsider. She'd wasted energy attempting to prove her worthiness to people who had no intention of granting her the dignity she'd been seeking. Now she understood that the most powerful thing you could do when people tried to make you small was to build something so significant that their opinions became irrelevant. Not because you'd proven them wrong, but because you'd made their approval unnecessary. Margaret Whitmore could spend her remaining years in federal prison or comfortable exile. It didn't matter to Adeline's daily reality anymore. The Whitmore family could continue their decline into irrelevance or somehow rebuild their reputation. Those outcomes had no impact on Equitech's continued growth or Maya's happy childhood. Adeline had learned the difference between winning and succeeding. Winning meant defeating people who'd opposed you. Succeeding meant building something so valuable that whether they opposed you became completely irrelevant. As the evening wound down and her friends helped clean the kitchen while Maya fell asleep in Rosa's arms, Adeline realized she'd stopped thinking about the Whitmores entirely unless someone asked about them for interviews or legal proceedings. They'd become characters in a story about her past rather than forces that shaped her present. The woman who'd once been desperate for their acceptance now felt only gratitude for their rejection. If they'd embraced her, she would have spent her life trying to fit into their world instead of building one that served justice. If they'd supported Andrew's vision, Equitech would have become another privileged technology company serving affluent markets instead of a revolutionary platform that dismantled inequality wherever it operated. Their cruelty had forced her to discover capabilities she'd never known she possessed and to build relationships based on shared values rather than social convenience. Their systematic attempts to destroy her had taught her exactly what she was capable of when people underestimated someone with nothing left to lose and everything still to fight for. 3 years after Andrew's death, Adeline Parker had become someone her younger self wouldn't have recognized. Not because she'd changed who she was fundamentally, but because she'd discovered who she'd always been underneath the layers of people-pleasing and permission-seeking that had characterized her earlier life. She was someone who could build billion-dollar platforms while raising a toddler. Someone who could transform systematic oppression into systematic justice. Someone who could take the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turn it into the best thing that had ever happened to millions of people who'd needed exactly what she'd learned to create. Most importantly, she was someone who could look at her daughter sleeping peacefully in their warm, safe home and know that Maya would grow up understanding that love expressed through justice was the most powerful force in the world. The story that had started with a pregnant widow being thrown out of her home had become something much larger. It had become proof that sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up giving you exactly what you need to become unstoppable. If you've ever felt dismissed by people who should have supported you, if you've ever been underestimated because of who you are or where you come from, if you've ever wondered whether kindness and determination can really triumph over systematic cruelty, then remember Adeline Parker's story. Remember that the most powerful response to people who try to make you small is to build something so significant that their opinions become irrelevant. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories about people who transformed their worst moments into their greatest triumphs. And remember that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even with people who wronged you. Sometimes the best revenge is building something beautiful with the pieces of what they broke. Because in the end, grace doesn't always mean forgiveness. Sometimes grace means building something so powerful and meaningful that forgiveness becomes unnecessary. Sometimes grace means proving that love expressed through justice can transform the world in ways that cruelty never could. The pregnant widow who'd once begged for acceptance from people who'd never intended to give it had become someone who no longer needed anyone's permission to change the world. And that transformation was perhaps the most beautiful legacy she could leave for the daughter who would grow up knowing that strength and kindness weren't opposing forces, but the combined foundation for everything worth building.